Rat-a-tat-tat! Rat-a-tat-tat! The pulse of machine-gun fire was still throbbing in his ears, battering his eardrums, when Brigadier-General Barnes Fothergill awoke that morning. Not that there was anything so special about that. Recurring dreams are quite common. Brigadier-General Barnes Fothergill had caught only the tail end of the first big show back in the days when he was an 18-year-old private. Even so, he had had one or two nasty scrapes. Once he and several comrades were out on night patrol when a flare went up. Instead of doing the proper thing and freezing, a couple of the men ran for cover. The patrol was fired on by an enemy machine-gun nest. Two were mown down instantly, while a couple more got hit in the legs. Barnes Fothergill managed to dive for cover completely uninjured. He remained in his shell crater for over half an hour before sneaking off and finding better cover. The retired Brigadier-General looked out of his bedroom window upon a mournful prospect. A dense, sallow fog submerged every form and contour. No, not even the outlines of the branches of the nearby elm in the garden could be seen. Being rather absent-minded, the old soldier was often unable to find his clothes in the morning. Last thing at night he was wont to undress wherever his whims dictated, in the bathroom, in the hall or landing, in the kitchen, indeed, in any of the 17 rooms that belonged to his rambling mansion. To complicate matters further, Miss Ailey, the housekeeper, had her own habit of tidying up after him with such ruthless efficiency that odd articles of clothing would be spirited away for hours, even weeks, before eventually resurfacing somewhere or other. Miss Ailey, who lived as tenant in what had been the gamekeeper's cottage, had the run of the house, and would often have completed her tidying and mopping up operations by the time the Brigadier-General roused from his sleep. At this time she was often down in the village to do the shopping and have coffee at the vicarage. She was usually back by 11 to make breakfast. This meant that the Brigadier-General would often mope around the house in his shroud-like gown as he made tea or went about the house looking for his clothes, muttering, "It was never like this when I had a Batman." As he descended the staircase that morning, the creaky boards seemed to creak rather more loudly than usual. In the hall he noticed that the old grandfather clock had stopped in the night, around midnight evidently. The Times was on the coffee table in the lounge, an indication that it was later than 10 when it was usually delivered. Miss Ailey had evidently placed it there for him to read before breakfast. The Brigadier-General thought about making himself a nice, cosy pot of tea and settling down to a good old read. No, first he would have a look at the obituary column, unquestionably the first imperative of the day. He turned the light switch, as it was rather dim in the room. Drat! Not another fuse or power cut. As there was just enough light to read by, he would bother with that later. Yet there was balm in Gilead, the obituary column. A certain Very Reverend Ewart Fraser of Perth, Scotland, headed the day's list. Apparently he had written voluminously on such doctrines as perseverance and perfectibility, and had otherwise distinguished himself in the penning of numerous works of devotional interest. Second place was claimed by one Lord Dick Turner Sidcup, in his time a prominent trades union figure, who had been awarded a life peerage during the Wilson administration. An eminent scientist came third. Then the old soldier could hardly believe his eyes. There it was in solid black lettering. General Arthur Stanmore Phipps. Poor old Stanners, muttered the brigadier-general as he scratched his left ear. Funny, he gave me a buzz just the other week. Said he was feeling a little below par. Copped it, eh? How we used to joke about which of us would be the first to stiff it. The brigadier-general raised a chuckle when he read one of the more absurd laudatios contained in the obituary. The bit that really made him snort was, "It cannot be disputed that the general possessed an immensely impressive tactical sense as well as unfathomable reserves of personal courage. Nowhere was proof of his qualities more closely given than in the North African theatre." The brigadier was one of the few who knew the true story. He knew what lay behind the miracle of Ain al-Sheikh. Stanners, who was in command of a light armoured column, had completely lost his bearings. In fact, he was 25 miles due west of where he thought he was. He was out of ammo and petrol. He then made out a well-camouflaged supply dump near a small oasis and took this to be the British supply base. Of course it wasn't. When the Germans saw British tanks coming for them at full throttle, they could draw no conclusion other than that the tip of a hitherto ingeniously concealed armoured spearhead, doubtless packed with all the punch Monty could muster, had come to view like that of a deadly iceberg. Having been under the impression that the nearest enemy concentrations were over 30 kilometres away to the east, the German commanding officer fell into a panic and ordered a retreat. The dust the German track vehicles threw up gave their positions away to aerial reconnaissance. Within an hour Monty had his long-range artillery trained on them, and there was a rout. Fortunately, Stanner's column ran out of petrol before reaching the minefield that had been laid around the dump. Had its presence been noted by British reconnaissance, it would have been pounded by its own side, friendly fire being taken for the enemy. The brigadier-general's eye wandered down to the lowest section of the obituary column, where the biggest shock of all awaited him. Brigadier-General Reginald Barnes Fothergill. Once the brigadier had somewhat recovered from the initial impact made by so strange a recognition, he became aware that a most terrible and unpardonable injustice had been committed. Stanner's life had received about 3 times as much column space as his own, and nowhere in his obituary was there any mention of his brilliant mastery of the martial arts, his heroic feats, his exemplary devotion to duty. Had not Eisenhower praised his cool-headed caution in the Normandy theatre, his judicious restraint and timing in the Ardennes? Had not Churchill commended his alertness in recognizing the danger at Dunkirk and the speed with which he had got his men out of the Pas-de-Calais? Compared to such deplorable omissions, the fact that he had been included in the obituaries at all dwindled in importance to the point where it appeared to be nothing but a mere clerical error, the most venial of aberrations. What an insipid end! Brigadier-General Barnes Fothergill, who had led a retired and uneventful life in recent years, died in his sleep around midnight on the 19th of January, or the early hours of the 20th, at his Surrey home. No flowers. He dialed the number of the Times, but the line was dead. He tried 1 or 2 local numbers with no greater success. With such an affront weighing on his mind, he just had to get through to somebody and release his pent-up feelings somehow. Hardly conscious of what he was doing, he nervously dialed a number through force of habit. Someone answered this time. A voice at the other end, with a thin, almost eerie timbre, answered, "This is General Arthur Stanmore Phipps speaking." "You, Stanners, I thought you were dead." "You dodderguts, "Shortly, you've gone for a Burton, haven't you? Like me, apparently. Been trying to get through to the Times all morning. The line was dead. Excuse me, man. I think someone's at the door." The brigadier waited and waited, but Stanners didn't return to the phone. He decided he couldn't hold the line any longer and replaced the receiver. Just then he heard a sound. Rat-a-tat-tat! Rat-a-tat-tat! Who would knock like that at his front door? As the old soldier approached the door, a strange feeling overcame him. On a day when his own obituary had appeared in the Times, when this obituary had only a fraction of the space that Stanners enjoyed, when two old soldiers had been ousted from the top section of the obituary column by a trades unionist and an obscure boffin, when nothing functioned as it should, the lights, the telephone, not even the old faithful grandfather clock in the hall, then anything was possible. Nothing would surprise him now, not even if the angel of death was the one knocking at the door. He even entertained the vague suspicion that the one knocking so insistently at the door was none other. Old soldiers have faced death many times. They respect, even fear it, but they are not overawed by death. He clenched his teeth, like he did the first time he went over the top. He closed his eyes, like he did when the flare went up. He groped for the door latch. Just as he said "now," he sensed a cold, bracing draught of air about his face. The door creaked. When he opened his eyes, he found no one. He saw nothing in front of him but the dense, sallow fog. He stepped forward. He stepped forward again. If you had been standing at the doorway of his house that morning, you would not have seen him take the third step he took. What they say about old soldiers, not dying but just fading away, seems to be true, in his case at least.